let's get to our guest here. I'm so honored to have Alex Kotlowitz join us. Alex, welcome.
Oh, Larry, thanks for having me. Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks for being here. So where I think we ought to begin is in summer, your latest book. You chronicle the summer of 2013 on the streets of Chicago in an amazingly intimate, moving way. What was the genesis of this book? What said to you, I've got to do this? And let me make a plug, first of all, because uh, Wes Moore is familiar to the audience of The Citizen. He was at our Ideas Seals Festival. He said that your book 30 some years ago, There Are No Children Here, changed his life. I'm probably in that category as well. So your body of work, and guys, check out Alex's latest New Yorker piece, which is an update, a sort of interestingly hopeful update of another one of his books, the other side
of the river.
Yeah, which was also fantastic. So with all that said, why this book and why now?
Well, first of all, Larry, thanks for having me on, and thanks for bringing up Wes Moore, who I love and hope he wins the gubernatorial race in Maryland. But I've been, and I suspect this is the case for you and others in Philadelphia, have been kind of perplexed and angered and haunted by the stubborn persistence of the violence over the years. I mean, it's been some 30 years I've been reporting from these neighborhoods, and one of the constants, it's not the only constant, but one of the constants is the violence. And there was this moment in time. In fact, when I was writing my book, there was this moment in time when it looked like things were getting better. But of course, they've taken a dramatic turn this past couple of years. My feeling was, as I felt like, as I listened to the conversation that emerged after all the school shootings, like in Parkland and Newtown, that we were really asking all the right questions. How did we get to this moment? What can we do to prevent this? What is it going to be like for the families of those who were lost and their capacity to move on? How is the violence going to shape or reshape their lives? We don't ask those questions, or we've stopped asking those questions about people lost to the street violence in our cities. And so I wanted to, as best I could, write a really intimate book that brought some humanity to the people who, in one manner or another, are touched by the violence, as victims, as perpetrators, as family members. And I just thought it was really important to remind ourselves that this violence, there's this notion that I think that people kind of get numb to it, but that it gets in your bones and in some ways comes to shape who you are.
Why, if the summer that you chronicled was 2013, and this gets to your process,
right,
what took so long to get the book out to the readers?
Well, Larry, that's my doing. I actually, so I got to tip my hat to Dave Isay, a dear friend who is the founder of StoryCorps, and Dave and I were in New York. It was May of 2013, and I was talking to him about that I was trying to figure out a way, because I've written a lot about this, trying to figure out a way that I could continue to write about this. He said, why don't you just write about one summer? And I love the idea, in part because I thought, oh, well, that'll be a quick book. I can spend the summer, report it, maybe another 6 months, and then write it. And of course, what happened is once I got immersed in the lives of the people that I met, I stayed with them. And as their stories unfolded, it revealed so much more about them, their communities, about the violence, about the intersection of race and poverty. And so what I thought was going to be 6 months of reporting turned into 4 years, which is often the case for me. It's
well, and it's fascinating. The level of sort of your level of immersion is something. It's a throwback. We don't see this kind of narrative reporting anymore. Can you talk about that? How much?
Yeah, I wouldn't say we don't see it anymore. I mean, there are others in this craft who I so admire. I mean, Kate Boo, Tracy Kidder, some of the folks at This American Life. So it's not lost art, but it is one that for me, it's really about telling stories. I feel really, especially in this moment in time where there's so much shouting going on, I think we don't, where people are kind of being pushed and pulled to think the way the speechifier thinks. The beauty of stories is it lets people find their own ways, and that's, for me, is really important. And the beauty of stories too is that it doesn't necessarily answer questions, but it asks questions, or at least asks questions that people have stopped asking. And I just feel really very strongly that we've got to find a way to continue telling stories, whether they be nonfiction, as in my case, or whether they be fiction. It's how we make sense of the world.
That's right. That's right. Everything is in some ways, everything is a narrative, right? It's just our public discourse has been so taken over by 140 character statements that it's hard. Technology was supposed to free us up, and yet
I know. And the other part of technology, of course, too, there was this, I don't want to transgress too much here, but when the internet was birthed, we all thought, well, this is the great democratization of this country. We're going to have this really open conversation amongst people. And of course, all it did is push people in even more into their silos. And so we're just talking to ourselves.
That's right. That's right. That's why I think what you do is so valuable, and it's valuable on a personal level to a reader, because I have to say, I find myself reading Summer, for example. I find myself sort of falling in love with these characters and wanting to these are people who I would want to hang out with. But had I read about them in the newspaper coverage of what drew you to them in the first place, I probably wouldn't give them a second thought. Right? That really says something, I think.
Right. And that's what I was hoping to accomplish, is to sort of get beyond the headlines, this notion that we think we know these people, and yet we, in the end, really know very little. And in fact, I purposely, the book opens, I won't get into the story much, but opens with this young boy, Marcelo, who is out committing robberies, stealing cell phones with some friends, and somewhat violently. They didn't have weapons, but they were, they knocked somebody to the ground, and that, it wasn't in the newspaper, but had it been, that would have been the headline, and there is so much more to this young man. He is such a richer, complicated, fuller human being than that moment would lend us to think.
He was actually a straight A student, if I remember correctly.
He was. He walked this kind of tightrope. He was a straight A student at a top parochial school in the city, and also involved in a local street gang. And the story is about sort of navigating that tightrope, and trying to find your footing, trying to find out who you really are.
And one of the points you make is that there actually is not a choice to be in a gang or not, right?
Right. With the landscape, I don't know what it's like in Philadelphia, but when I wrote There Are No Children Here, the gangs were highly organized. They were hierarchical. They were organized around the drug trade, and most of the violence was over drug turf. And in the late 1990s, the feds took off the head of the snake. They arrested all the leaders of the gangs, and the unintended consequence of that is the gangs just splintered. And so now we literally have hundreds of cliques or crews organized block by block, and who end up in disputes having nothing to do with turf or drugs, but over petty stuff or things they can't even remember. And so the irony is that hierarchy in the gangs is gone. And having said that, I will say a lot of the old time gangsters I talk to, they will talk about in somewhat romantic terms of the old days when they had greater control, and but as I point out to them, the violence was just as bad then as it is today, and in some cases even worse.
Right. Well, I want to ask you about a couple of the characters, if you could just
Please.
share their, because I could not stop thinking about Thomas and Anita Stewart.
Right.
Um, can you talk to me about who they were,
Sure.
who they are, and that relationship?
Right. So Thomas was, when I met him, he was 16 years old. He was a junior at a Harper High School on the south side of the city. And I actually met him doing a two-part series for This American Life. And Thomas was this kid who had seen kind of the zelig of violence in Englewood in his community. He had seen a lot. And when I met up with him, it was in August, and that June, he had been sitting on the front porch of a house, an abandoned property next to his, with his brother and his best friend, this girl who also attended Harper. And somebody ran out of a gangway and started shooting and ended up shooting and killing his friend, Shikaki. And Thomas was absolutely devastated and lost and in great distress. And it's a story about his emerging from that moment and in the folds of this incredible social worker, Anita Stewart, who sees something in Thomas I don't think anybody else could see. I mean, I think those, well, I know those around, those at the school saw Thomas as this angry young man, and he was angry. I mean, understandably.
Yeah.
And it was often misdirected. In fact, right after the shooting, he ended up another young man, I guess, shoved his young cousin, and Thomas was so angry that he punched him so hard that one of the young man's teeth embedded in his fist. And Thomas talks about how much better he felt after he'd done that, and I think he was trying to sort of articulate these feelings that he had really trouble with. And Anita stays with them. I mean, Thomas ultimately graduates, Anita ends up leaving Harper, but their relationship continues. And it's a story about this boy, ultimately young man, who's got this one adult in his life who.
And he sees the murder that you talked about is just one of many
Right.
that he's seen.
Right.
He was at 12 years old at a birthday party. I mean, it's harrowing stuff, and yet he's so much braver than I would be in this situation. He ends up testifying.
Yeah, he does something kind of remarkable that he could identify the shooter, and he ends up at his own peril, ends up going to court and identifying the shooter. And in fact, afterwards, I think, though he wouldn't say it, but I think because he was fearful, ends up leaving Chicago for St. Louis for a year and a half. And it's unusual, to be honest, because most murders, I don't know what it's like in Philadelphia, but most murders are not solved in Chicago. And certainly most shootings aren't. And this was an unusual case.
Yeah, Philadelphia has about a 40% clearance rate, which doesn't mean it's solved. It just means that there's an arrest made, right?
Right. Well, not even right in Chicago. It doesn't even mean an arrest. It may mean that they know who did it, but they don't have enough to arrest them, or somebody's left town or passed away. Yeah.
And just another quick, there's so many in here, but who is Eddie Bocanegra and Doris Hernandez?
Yeah. So Eddie, who is a dear friend, just a remarkable human being. Now, having said that, when he was 18 years old, Eddie shot and killed a rival gang member. Eddie's two men who were about 10 years older than him, who were kind of mentors to him, had been shot and wounded. One of them was paralyzed, and Eddie was just filled with rage, and he goes out in the streets a few weeks later seeking revenge, and ends up shooting and killing someone he doesn't know, and is quickly arrested and sent to prison. And at first, Eddie's he's kind of a tough guy, and he makes his way through prison that way. But I think he begins to try to look for a way to try to find some forgiveness for what he did, and more importantly, try to find a way to forgive himself. And when Eddie gets out of prison, he ends up working for an organization here, what was then called Ceasefire, now Cure Violence, and he becomes an outreach worker and ends up working with people in the street trying to interrupt disputes. And he now runs, I think, one of the most innovative anti-violence prevention programs in the country. But it's a story about forgiveness, but not about asking for forgiveness from others, but asking for forgiveness from yourself. And it's what he wrestles with. And every anniversary on July 17th, the year he took this young man's life, he goes out and will spend time with people he often doesn't know who have lost a loved one, and spend time with them, bring them flowers. And it's become a part of his routine every year.
And the meeting he has with Doris Hernandez is really moving.
Right. So this is a woman he's known who lost her son to the streets, and Eddie, along with a woman who ultimately becomes his wife, organize a group of mothers who have lost children, which is still going on to this day. Eddie and Catherine still are involved in that. And Eddie goes to meet with Doris on this July 17th, brings her flowers. And he, for the first time, Doris, I don't think, realized what Eddie had done. And Eddie talks about that he had killed someone. And Eddie, as Eddie is apt to do, is really worried that this is going to be the end of their relationship. And she ends up, embracing him. I mean, she knows who he is, and that she knows that one moment shouldn't define who he is.
Yeah, it's really. I find myself getting choked up now as you talk about it.
Yeah. Eddie is a beautiful human being.
Well, you could argue that what the book does is chronicle the after effects of post-traumatic distress, and at one point you even say that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was wrong,
Right.
that there are 5 stages of grief. What did you mean by that?
Well, she talks about these 5 stages of grief that are very orderly. And as I came to realize, grief, at least in our cities, is much messier than that. And part of what's going on is it's much messier because you lose someone to the violence, a family member, a friend, and then you're looking over your shoulder to who might be next. And in fact, that's why the analogy to PTSD, to post-traumatic stress disorder, goes only so far, because for those returning from combat, say, they're able to leave that behind, but that's not the case for those in the streets. And actually, one of the people who actually was incredibly helpful in my thinking about this is a Philadelphian, Ted Corbin, who runs a group called Healing Hurt People. And I spent some time with Ted years ago, and with some of his clients, and it really got me thinking about this trauma in a much more profound way. So you're right, much of the book is about that trauma, that personal and collective trauma.
How do you, middle-aged, balding white guy,
that goes for both of us,
it's like I'm looking in a mirror, embed yourself in these? How do you gain trust, and how do you strike up these relationships?
Right. So let me say, look, I'm asking a lot of people, right? I'm asking them not only to share their stories, but to share them in this very public way. And so a couple of things. One, as I try to be as open and straight and honest with people about what my intentions are and about how I work. And one of the questions I often get asked from people initially, is what's in it for me? They may not ask it quite like that. They might ask, am I getting paid? Why should I do this? And so I try to help people think about why they might want to share their story publicly. And I think everybody has different reasons. For an Eddie Bocanegra, for example, it's clear. I mean, Eddie wants to tell his story in the hope that it might make it easier for others who have had similar journeys as his own. For others, it might be that nobody's ever come along and asked them about themselves. So everybody has their own reasons. And I try, and I fail at times, but I try as best I can to make sure there are no surprises, that people are fully aware of what I'm writing. And certainly if I can't sort of sit down and ask them about it or confront them about it eye to eye, I have no business writing it on the page. But I think one of the things that's hard is I do work really hard at trying to establish this intimacy. Isabel Wilkerson calls it this kind of accelerated intimacy, because you're asking questions, that you in some ways have no business asking, and trying to find that intimacy, but not feel too intrusive. And it's kind of a fine line to walk. And I will tell you that one of the things for me, one of the perks about this work is that many, not all, but many of the people I write about, become a part of my life.
Well, the book begins with, if you read your book 30 years ago,
right?
No Children,
Here, yeah.
You begin with Pharaoh,
right?
Who it turns out was living with you at one point. It made me wonder how much you bring home and what the lines are between your personal life and the work.
Yeah, I mean, I think those lines quickly get blurred. You spend time with people, and you're asking them to be incredibly open and honest with you, and it's inevitable that you build up some kind of relationship with them. And some of those relationships just grow and blossom over the years. And there are a number of them. One of the stories in the book, I just want to give a shout out, because she's all Philadelphian, she goes by Ashara in the book, but her real name, and I've asked her if it's okay to use it, as Nunera Moon. And she lives in Philadelphia. She's in fact now working on a documentary, which I'm really excited about following four Black boys in Philadelphia, and sort of asking the question about what it means to become a Black man. And Nunera's story in the book is about her trying to reckon with her disappointment over the years with the Black men in her life. And it's a story about one of her best friends growing up who ends up involved in a murder, and the correspondence that they have, which is incredibly profound and open.
Yeah, there's a scene where you're with them in a restaurant, and she shuts down and and I'm actually rooting for them to. Of course, I'm rooting for them to fall in love.
Right. Yeah. Nunera is actually getting married this summer, but to somebody who I absolutely adore, and it's not him. But she's maintained a friendship, but yeah, it's this story, and when I began that story, I actually thought the story was going to be about these two brothers, and I met Nunera, and as soon as I met Nunera, I thought, this is who I want to be spending time with.
That's great. Yeah, how much of this is planned, and how much of it is serendipity by just because you're just showing up?
Right. Well, I think there's a luck involved, but I think earned luck. And I sometimes compare my work to digging for gold, which you kind of know what you're looking for. You know where to look for it, you know the tools, but if you find it, you feel pretty damn fortunate. And so, I was looking around for stories, and I was looking around for stories that surprised me, that knocked me off balance. That for me was a simple measure. And again, and you sort of said this at the beginning, I was looking for people that I wanted to spend time with. I figured if I wanted to spend time with them, then readers would want to spend time with them as well.
Yeah, that's great. We're gonna, if you have questions for Alex, drop them in the Q&A box. But meantime, I want to bring in our own Jo Piazza, because she has been doing this kind of work over the last year in Philadelphia, and produced this tremendous podcast. Jo, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Alex, I'm just so in awe of all of the work that you've done. And I nearly teared up just now while you were talking to Larry, which I never tear up around Larry. And also, by the way, thank you for letting me join two middle-aged balding men as the only fresh spring chicken lady in the room. But I almost teared up when you were talking about storytelling and narrative, and just how goddamn important that is. Because I had my first meeting about this podcast with Larry and Roxanne nearly 2 years ago. And what I said to them is, I'm like, I want to tell stories. And if you guys aren't going to let me do that, I'll do a different podcast with someone else. But that is what I care about, because aside from the writing of Helen Abenius in the Philadelphia Inquirer, I never see it in Philadelphia media. You know, we certainly do not see it on the local news, where we see 3 minutes about a shooting in so-and-so neighborhood and then never hear anything else. And reading your recent piece in the New Yorker, I kept thinking that the people most affected by the gun violence also just never see themselves in the media that they're consuming, in the news media they're consuming. And so I think more and more, I'm like, how can we make sure that we're telling these stories in a way that reaches a wide audience and not just an academic, highbrow New Yorker audience? Like, how can we be getting the stories that you spent 4 years, you thought you were going to spend a year. I thought I was going to spend 6 months. I spent a year and a half, right? We've spent so much time embedded in these stories. How can we get them to the people that need to be hearing them?
Yeah. You know, Jo, it's a question I really wrestle with. You know, I spent many years ago, I was a staff writer at the Wall Street Journal. We were still writing about these very issues for them back in the 80s and early 90s. And one of the things I loved about being at the Journal was just that, as I was reaching an audience that I would never have had an opportunity to engage in conversation otherwise. You know, they tended to be conservative, wealthy, in business and politics, and it's one of the things I miss about working at a place like the Journal, and one of the things now is, given how divided this country is, I don't know how we find a way to tell stories that will reach others as well. I grapple with this a lot. I mean, there are two things that stories can do. One is that they, of course, bring us places we otherwise wouldn't go and introduce us to people we otherwise wouldn't meet. You know, it's this kind of incredible license to, an inexpensive license to travel, you know, in the world. But the other things that stories do is they often also affirm experiences. You know, that somebody hears a story and says to themselves, "It's my story." And stories have this capacity to make people feel less alone. And so I think it is really important that we find a way to tell stories that reach others who have their own preconceptions and assumptions about the people and places we're writing about. It's also important too that we find a way that those stories reach people whose experiences are mirrored and those stories as well.
And I have noticed that we've been able to do that in the podcast form, and it's been so interesting because, you know, we get the people that are often traditional podcast users, but because, same as you, we kind of embedded ourselves in these communities that are experiencing the gun violence. We brought in listeners who are like, "Wait, that is me. That's me. That is my story," and they feel good about being able to share their stories that no one has paid attention to, that no one has necessarily been telling before. So the audio platform has been very interesting for that, and I'm curious about exploring it more to see what we can do with it. But one of the things I know that frustrated Larry while I was working on this podcast, I feel like I frustrate Larry every day, was that, you know, Philadelphia Citizen, we are about solutions. We are a solutions-based media platform. And Larry and our editors kept saying, "Well, where's this? We need more solutions." And I would just kind of like bang my head against a wall and say, the solutions are so complicated. There's not one solution, there's so many. And I want to hear what you think are some of the solutions.
Yeah, let me talk about it in a moment, but I do want to talk about this. I mean, and it's worthy of probably a conversation another time, but just to touch on this notion of, you know, that when we tell stories, we should offer solutions. I've taken a couple of hits, both in the New York Times and in the New York Review of Books from my book, both of which were very praiseworthy, but each of them said, "But where are the solutions? Why isn't Congress offering the solutions?" And I feel really strongly, again, that we tell stories not to answer questions, but to ask them. And that it seems to me that there's a place to offer, to look at what's working and not working out there. But there also is a place to just simply expose what people, the weight that bears down people's shoulders, what people are wrestling with, how people are kind of still standing erect in this world that's slumping around them. And so I feel really strongly about this, that we don't necessarily need to always offer solutions when we tell stories. Having said that, obviously this is an arena that I've been deeply enmeshed in for many years. And there are things out there that work. One of the programs, honestly, that for me is most impressive is Healing Hurt People in your hometown, Philadelphia.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, what Ted Corbin has done there is really remarkable. And I had a number of years ago, I had done a story for This American Life about one of the clients there. And one of the things that was remarkable to me was how the men that I met in that program were so self-aware about what they had experienced after being shot.
Yeah.
They were talking about the same, they had a language for it, and a language that I hadn't heard others use before. There's this program that I mentioned that Eddie Bocanegra runs, Ready Chicago, where which does both provides employment to people, which is nothing new, but also requires participants, all of whom are young men who have been touched by the violence in one manner, to undergo cognitive behavioral therapy, again, to deal with the trauma. But it seems to me that some of the solutions are pretty self-evident and have been out there for a long time. Let's be straight. I mean, the violence that we're talking about in Philadelphia and Chicago are happening in profoundly distressed neighborhoods, and often neighborhoods of color.
Yeah.
And so what it says to me is we've got to find a way to rebuild and refortify these communities, so the provision of well-paying jobs, of adequate housing, of, good schools. I mean, all the things that, make up the social compact. And so I think we shouldn't lose sight of that in some ways the violence is really a symptom of something.
Yeah, no, Alex, I'm bowing down at your altar right now, because that has been my answer so many times. I'm like, if we want to solve gun violence, let's solve poverty, systemic racism, and our terrible broken education system. And that could be a nice small start to it. But and Roxanne, our editor, is pointing out in the chat that there are some proven solutions. Exactly like you said, the Ready program, Healing Hurt People. When I was doing the podcast, what I saw in Philadelphia, and I'm curious if you saw this in Chicago, Roxanne also mentions Oakland ceasefire. We interviewed David Mohammed, who was incredible. But these organizations were not getting the funding, the attention, or the cohesive backing from our city that they needed to actually thrive, to actually reach more than, say, 30 men that could be at risk for shooting. What did you see in Chicago?
Right. Well, it's the same issue in Chicago, but I do have the question, and it's not clear to me. So some of the programs you talk about, like CRED, and I believe Oakland ceasefire, employ outreach workers, not unlike Cure Violence here, what used to be ceasefire here.
Right. Yeah.
And what's not clear to me is whether those programs can be scaled up in a way that would really make a difference. I mean, one of the things for me that is unsettling at the moment is, given all these programs, like in my city, is we're seeing numbers not too dissimilar from what you're seeing in Philadelphia in terms of the violence.
Yeah.
And it says to me that we've got to be doing something more, and maybe something also different. The other part of all this, and I'm sure Philadelphia has to do with the relationship between the police and these communities, which has really deteriorated over the years. And I look at my city, our closure rates when I was working on my book for murders were in the roughly 20-25%. The police claim it's higher now. But if I were superintendent of police, that would be my priority, is to figure out a way how to solve violent crimes. Because otherwise what you're doing is your presence is really one of almost as a nuisance of arresting people for what seem like petty offenses, and those who commit the worst get away, and it gives license, I think, for people to continue. And the other leg of all this, of course, is the availability of guns.
Yeah.
In our city, we took off. This is an astonishing number. It's astonishing because it's almost the same number every year. But the police took off 11,000 illegal guns off the street last year in Chicago. I mean, I feel really strongly about this. It's not going to be the only answer, but we've got to figure out a way to regulate the gun industry better.
You know, if I could jump in for a second, I actually think you are positing solutions in your narrative, because that, I think when I wrote the thing in advance, I think I said something about like that you perform a master class on empathy sentence by sentence, and I think like that actually is ultimately the solution, right? To get people to actually see the common humanity in others in this milieu.
Right. No, I think, Larry, well, first of all, thanks. And I think you're right. I was, you having, I can't remember the author's last name, Sasha Eisenberg, to talk about same-sex marriage. And I think one of the reasons why there was this incredible turnaround in this country in same-sex marriage is because of proximity, is because people knew somebody who was gay, right? And, or a friend, family member, and and Brian Stevenson talks about this as the power of proximity. And short of having that in your own life, the other way, of course, is through stories, through empathy. And absolutely, and that was one of the things with all my writing is hope that, when people read my work, that they begin to look at the people in my books and the people they might meet or pass on the street. They look at them differently than they might have before. And they see, rather than all these differences, they just see the commonalities. So absolutely. I mean, I think, for example, there's this myth out there with all the violence in our cities that people, excuse my language, shit happens and people move on. But people don't, people are, I mean, imagine losing a child or losing a parent or losing a friend to the violence. I mean, sort of being able to move on from that, I think, takes a profound sense of will and sense of self.
Yeah, we opened the podcast, our first episode, by saying you can't solve a problem that you can't see, that you don't care about. And I think it's exactly what you're saying right now about empathy and trying to open people's eyes to why the hell they need to care about this issue. An amazing thing that did happen over the year and a half we reported this was that the Philadelphia Inquirer finally started publishing obituaries from the Obituary Project, which told the stories and the narratives of every victim of gun violence in the city, the kinds of people whose deaths we don't hear enough about, but two, we don't hear about their lives.
Right.
We don't hear about them as human beings, which you did so beautifully in your book and in your New Yorker piece. So yeah, stories.
Yeah, no, I listened to the first part about the Obituary Project, which I just think is a wonderful idea. I was thinking, man, it'd be nice to have something like that here in Chicago. And one of the things that happens here, and I'm sure in Philadelphia, is that so often the kind of the immediate narrative after somebody is shot and killed is that they somehow got their just desserts, that they were a gang member, that they were involved in the drug trade or what have you. And often, first of all, it's wrong. It's a narrative that's often, set forward by the police. But it's such a simple narrative. And there's a woman in my book, Lisa Daniels, who loses her son. And that happens when her son is killed. He's identified as a convicted drug dealer. And as Lisa Daniels says, "You don't know my son."
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, and for a long time, apparently the Inquirer didn't want to publish them, or when a writer would suggest publishing them, as always happens in a newsroom, they're like, but were they in a gang? As if we can write off that someone deserved to be shot and murdered as if that's the most important thing about their life. And what I love about what the Obituary Project did is it always led with something like, he cooked the best goddamn burgers in South Philadelphia. And I'm like, yes, because that's what we want to know about any human who walked on this planet.
Yeah.
Alex, I have one last question for you before I have to hop. And I'm going to say that I have to hop off because our Philadelphia Under Fire podcast was nominated for an award from Billy Penn. And I need to find out if we win. And so it's going to happen in 5 minutes. But,
great. Well, good luck. Yeah.
But the one thing I want to ask you, and this is what happened to me, you've been doing this so much longer than I have, but from the beginning, did you feel like I can never walk away from this story. Like, because I've invested so much time and these people have invested so much in me, did you feel like I have to continue to follow this? I have to see
Yeah, it
this?
wasn't right. But I mean, I feel like my commitment to continuing to write about these issues, I mean, the violence, the intersection of race and poverty in this country, I mean, it has to do with this sort of fundamental belief that I have that life ought to be fair. And you spend time in the communities that you've spent time in, Jo, and you recognize how unfair it is, how unlevel that playing field is. And so, you know, you tell stories in some ways with the hope that those stories will lead to a sense of fairness. And I know it sounds a little Pollyannish, but it is ultimately why we tell stories, is, you know, to sort of bring some justice. There's a great line, Nelson Algren, the Chicago writer and poet, once talked about how stories are, that woman in the courtroom be undefended on a charge who asks, isn't anybody on my side? And I often think about that, because that's sort of why, you know, we tell stories, just sort of asking, you know, because what people are asking, isn't anybody on my side?
Right. Yeah. And I feel like I'm gonna have to be on that side and telling these stories now for as long as you have been. So thank you for doing what
Well, thanks, Jo. Good luck with, I hope you guys.
Thanks, guys. I'll pop back on and let you know.
Okay.
She really, as you can tell, immersed herself as you have. And I think you can also tell how forever it's changed her.
Yeah, it does that. Yeah, I listened to the first episode, which I loved, about obituaries. So I'm looking forward to listening to the rest of it.
You know, one of the things from the book that you reminded me of is that there are a number of myths that the narrative obliterates. You write on after Calvin's murder, on the night when the shooting began, 21 different neighbors called 9. Jo, I think you're not muted. On the night when the shooting began, 21 different neighbors called 911 to report multiple shots fired. They cared. They wanted the police to protect them. They were doing what neighbors do.
Right.
There's this narrative now that's a convenient narrative for those not in the milieu to say that there's a moral failing in these.
Right. And the irony, of course, in that instance, was all these neighbors call 911. They hear multiple shootings from what's clearly a semi-automatic weapon, and it's the police shooting who end up shooting and killing an unarmed young man. One of the officers had a military grade rifle and shot all 25 rounds at this young man. I mean, for me, it's the story in the book that makes me the most angry. I mean, it's a story about police accountability, or the lack of police accountability. You know, these 3 officers come upon these 2 young men, one of them Calvin Cross, and they claim that Calvin, reaches into his playing around with something in his shorts, and they think it's drugs or a weapon, and they tell him to stop, and he runs. And I suspect, like for many young black men, he's afraid of the police, and these 3 officers get out. They claim that this Calvin turned around and started shooting at them. There was no operable gun found anywhere in the area, and they 45 rounds of ammunition, and ended up shooting him pretty much at point blank range in a vacant lot after he'd been shot and was there perhaps already dying. And those police were all given commendations, and nothing was ever done. And the irony is, it was the Department of Justice, when they investigated the police behavior in the city, it ended up being the lead incident that they talked about in that report. The DOJ was so angry by what they learned.
How do you, we have a question from an anonymous attendee. How do you manage your own mental health when reporting on such hard subjects? It's got to be traumatic for you as well.
Right. This was a particularly hard book. This book, and There Are No Children Here. With this one, and I've told this story before, which I didn't think I was going to talk about publicly, but there was a moment when had done most of the reporting and was beginning to write. And usually there's something, for me at least, cathartic about the writing. And I was visiting some friends in Seattle, and I found myself in a real state of profound depression. I mean, something I'd never experienced before. I couldn't smile. I couldn't sort of taste or smell joy. It was, and so when I got back, I went to see a counselor, and it became clear, that what I was experiencing was vicarious or secondary trauma, and certainly some of the people in my book, as I thought back upon it, like Anita, the social worker, also experienced that same kind of vicarious or secondary trauma. And I try to use it as best I can to try to understand a little bit better what people like Eddie Bocanegra or Thomas or Marcelo are experiencing. But it was hard. And I think, to be honest, what keeps me going are the people that I meet and am writing about. I'm kind of, in some ways, in awe of what they've managed.
That's what I feel as a reader. I always try to measure myself against these characters.
Right.
I'd be in the fetal position.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Tell us. We have a few minutes, and your recent update in the New Yorker of the other side
of the river.
Tell us about. I found there was a lot to be hopeful in that, especially the mayor of St. Joe's. Made me think, all right, there's some progress here, but give us the wrap up or the
right. So this is a book that I wrote in the 1990s about the kind of Rashomon of race, about how we come to the world from such different places, often having everything to do with race, with our personal and collective experiences. And it takes place in these two small towns, one predominantly white, the other predominantly black. The white town is very prosperous, the black town is very poor, and they're separated by a river. And it's the story of a 16-year-old black teenager from the black town, last seen in the white town, whose body is found in the river 4 days later. And if you ask people in Benton Harbor in the black community, they said then, and they will still say 30 years later, that Eric most likely died at the hands of whites because he had been dating a white girl, which in fact he had. If you ask people in St. Joe, the white town, they'll tell you that Eric, who apparently had broken into a car, most likely tried to swim the river to get home to avoid the police. And so you have this, still 30 years later, people feel very strongly about this. The case was ruled an accidental drowning in the end. And just recently, a couple of weeks ago, somebody who claims to have been a witness to the last moments of Eric, has come forward. And so the police have created a task force and reopened the case. And these were two communities, I went there not because they were an anomaly, but because they, for me, were so emblematic of how we live our lives, so separate and so deeply unequal. And there are some things that haven't changed. People in Benton Harbor I talk to still are afraid to go into St. Joe, into the white town, including the mayor of Benton Harbor, who tells me that he won't let his 15-year-old son go to the beach in St. Joe. But as you point out, there are also things that were very kind of encouraging or inspiring. St. Joe, they elected a mayor. Well, this mayor, Mike Gary, who turns out he was the head of the Rotary Club when my book came out, and he invited me to talk to the Rotary. And so I go to this event up there, and these are small towns, and there are 600 people in this auditorium. They're all white, and I think, my God, what have I walked into? And the thing I remember about that day, I don't remember the questions, I don't remember the mood of the audience, but at the end, Mike gave me a pen, a gold pen that just said, "Thanks, Alex." And Mike told me that my book kind of inspired him to get involved in politics. And so he ran for city commission. He's now mayor. And it's kind of remarkable. I mean, he's bringing historians into his town, this white town, to talk about the history of race in this country, to talk about systemic and institutional racism. He's been a part of these talks, these brave talks, they call them, in people's living rooms. He led a Black Lives Matter protest across the bridge with the mayor from Benton Harbor after the murder of George Floyd. Man, that never would have happened 30 years ago. And so it said to me that maybe, because there are moments, and I'm sure you feel this way, especially given these last 4 years, where you feel incredibly distressed at the direction of this country. But that maybe there are things that are changing, that there is some progress. And I think about what's going on there, especially now, given all the kind of backlash to this notion of critical race theory, which really is just this idea of looking at the place of race in our history. That here's a small town that, without thinking about it, without knowing what they're doing, is getting people in this white town to think about the profound effects of the history of race on today.
That's really interesting, because when I saw the way that mayor talked about this is just a very practical. He's not accused. I think there's a backlash that comes when you accuse someone of being privileged, right?
Right.
And I won't get it right, but at some point he says, I'm not accusing you of anything, to a white fellow. Just how can we make things better?
Right. No, he's basically, what happens is people he's known for years come up and say, I'm not a racist, or why are you calling me a racist? And Mike says, you're not a racist, or you may not be a racist, or I'm not calling you a racist. But what I am saying to you is look at our history. And he points to redlining, he points to the disparities in wealth and in early deaths in the Black community, and says this has everything to do about the systemic or institutional racism, and we've got to find a way to address that. Yeah, it's a way of sort of not pointing fingers and yet quietly pointing fingers.
Right. And in some ways, getting people out of their corners by being gentler about the conversation.
Yeah.
Alex, I can't thank you enough. This is fascinating, and your work is you're an American treasure.
Oh, God, thanks, Larry.
I hope you come back and visit us in Philadelphia, because we'd love to have you for a live in-person event.
Well, that would be wonderful. I would love that. Yeah, Larry, this has been delightful. I just have had a really good time, and and I'd love to at some point continue the conversation around storytelling and especially storytelling from these kind of marginalized corners of our country. So,
absolutely, I think that is the great solution.
Well, you guys are doing great work, so keep at it.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. Appreciate you, and appreciate this audience. We'll hopefully see everyone live next week at the Fittler Club. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Larry.
Thanks, Alex.